In 2006, just after the Conservative government was elected and started to settle in Ottawa, I went to Ottawa and met several MPs and others in the Prime Minister's office. And I heard something that really stuck in my mind. It was a line that Canada's partner in the future in Asia, principal partner, should be India, not China, because China was a godless, totalitarian country with nuclear weapons aimed at us. And that was a rather different framing of an image of China and an attitude about China that seemed to be rooted, at least in the early days of the Conservative government. And I then began thinking about each of those words and took a look back at where they came from. Why, in fact, Canada had a very different approach than was suggested in that, but also what were the origins, what were the roots of some of that pretty hard view on what China might be and what it might be, where it might go, and how we should react to it. And a fair amount of the book, the first half of the book, is essentially about the history of the relationship, going back to the missionaries and then bringing it into the Conservative period. That hard line, that moralistic line on China, has a long pedigree in the Canadian context. Our mission movement was divided. We had different kinds of missionaries, but in that fundamentalist view, negative about a country, a regime, and sometimes a people, there was a long history of that in Canada. And while that's not the main feature of the book, I don't think we can understand the contemporary Conservative era without seeing its roots that go back a long way in the Canadian DNA. The first myth is the myth of changing China. The idea that for many, engaging China or relationship with China for the last 120 years has been about changing China. Its engagement has been built around commercial advantage, how we can get financial advantage, trade advantage, investment advantage from China. Long strand on that. Second part of it had always been geopolitical, end China's isolation, bring it into the world. But the third part in Canada was the moral enterprise. Engagement was about changing or influencing China. I think that the other myth is the myth of a special relationship. There was a view in the 1970s after we recognized China that we really had a special hold, a special place. And that's an ennobling myth. It looks for opportunities. It raises something exciting about China and the relationship, but it hasn't always proven to be very factually grounded. So myths can hide things, but they also can open up possibilities. And that myth of doing something big and special with China is a very distinctive part of the Canadian story. The argument in my book, and after looking at conservative China policy, is it's actually a bundle of four forces. One of them is an ideology of friends and enemies, an enemy of right and wrong, a moral compass that is heavily weighted towards freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. A second part is a philosophy of small government. You facilitate transactions, you don't build relationships. A third part of the conservative approach has been pure electoral. What can be done to maximize the chances of keeping conservative government in power. And the fourth part of it has been a kind of broad worldview and a particular emphasis now on economics. What is different about the conservative government right now is that they have not made a case to Canadians why that commercial interest overrides the geostrategic concerns that we have or where China is moving in the world. The moral case, curiously, for principled engagement, the conservative style, is contradictory at the moment. And we see decisions on Chinese foreign investment, state-owned enterprises here, foreign investment and protection and promotion agreements, being fought out not just as commercial issues, where there's some good debates, but also as fundamental issues of should we deal with this godless totalitarian country? Should we trust to China? Should we work with it? So to me, conservatism faces a contradiction on China policy that all governments do, and that the strictly commercial is probably not going to be persuasive to Canadians generally, but particularly in the China context. I think the important first step is for Prime Minister, our leaders in Ottawa, to make a case to present a strategy on Asia, but particularly on China. China is complex. Canadians recognize it's big, it's important, becoming more so, but also complicated. There's rising anxiety. And that anxiety right now is complicating many of the things that the Conservative government, at least at the top, Mr. Harper's side of things, wants to accomplish. Energy exports to Asia and to China in particular. I'd say secondly is that in China's case, the philosophy of small government, essentially letting other players do what they wish, that's not going to work, or at least it can only be part of the picture. Canadians are doing well in China, Canada is not, and it's going to take some leadership, some convening power, some new resources to reinforce that Canada is there as a big player. And that third part is uncomprehensive. Doing a commercial-only strategy with China puts us in the smaller leagues, probably defeats some of the things we'd like to accomplish even commercially. But I think the way going forward is Canada as a middle power in dealing with China. One of the surprises in writing the book, one of the interesting surprises, was what we found when we commissioned a piece on what Chinese views were of Canada. And curiously, it focused on the period 1968 to 70 when Canada and China negotiated diplomatic relations. And Ottawa knew very little about what was going on the Chinese side. What we have found now through an ambassador, a Chinese ambassador who worked through those files, was what were the Chinese thinking of Canada during that period. Well, in the flurry of memos between Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and the others on the standing committee of the Central Committee of the Political Bureau, a very interesting argument came of why Canada. And that was for three reasons. Canada was important because it was close to the United States. That's true, physically and in many other ways. Secondly, Canada was important because it was somewhat different than the United States in its approach to foreign affairs in particular. But third and most important was they saw in Canada a country that was bigger than commercial interest, that had something in terms of a view of the Cold War, a middle power relationship, our words, not theirs, that might provide openings for China in other things it wanted to do, including getting into the United Nations. So that big idea that Canada is something more than a commercial power, that it is somewhat interested in world affairs. In the 20th century, that was about the Cold War. In the 21st century, it's about a country that is between the old countries of the international order, the victors of World War II, and new and emerging countries that are arising. This is not about north-south, it's about accommodating a major power shift. And the Chinese then, and I think now, appreciate that special Canadian role.